Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Chickory painting class at the Minnesota School of Botanical Art. We're going to be exploring complex flowers and blues today. Chickory has got a unique color that is hard to capture sometimes. It's also got a structure that's a little complicated, but if you break it down into pieces and parts, it works. There's buds that are old and new. They're kind of different colors. And the colors that I use are cerulean and ultramarine, mostly. A little alizarin crimson, some yellows, warm and cool, but there's very little yellow in these plants, flowers. And I've already got several light washes down. You start pale because the flowers have a lot of translucency to them. You can see where the petals overlap. And I'm working pretty wet right now. I'm just starting to try and get the petals delineated where they overlap, where they wiggle or bend. And I'm going in with cerulean mostly, but I will at some point start using a little bit of the ultramarine to define the edges. The flowers have fine veining that are almost like little hills and valleys. So start to put some of them in. And the base of the petals has a greenish tint on some places, but it's also a little darker blue right before you get to the center of the flower. So with a little bit less moisture on the brush, starting to bring in some of those details. And it's just kind of working around the petals, finding the little bit darker spots, putting in some of the edges of each petal so you can start to see what's forward and what's back. And with combinations of the cerulean and the ultramarine and a little bit mixed together. I'm starting to, again, kind of bring the petal edges in with a little bit darker color. Each petal itself has a highlight and a low light, even though they're dull. And I like to work a little bit around the whole painting when I have certain colors. I'm bringing in the alizarin crimson here because there's a lot of places on the flower that have a faint pinkish tinge underneath the blue. So I'm doing this with a wash, feathering it out a little bit. I'm just building layers of color. Because these flowers are translucent, it takes a lot of layers to kind of keep the color soft without getting dark, but still bringing the dimension to each petal. And I do feather things out a lot in the two-brush system. Okay, we've zoomed in a little bit closer on the flower so you can see the subtle layers of color starting to build. I've started to put the tips of the petals in because they're slightly tinged darker, and there's usually 5. And as you can see, I'm just kind of building form. The buds are another story. They're got very little yellow in them. And the older flowers fold back on themselves and start to have still the sepals and petals showing, but they're starting to brown or dry a little bit. So I'm putting in some ochre sort of tint here to tell me that this is a spent flower folded up. The one behind it is a bright new bud. You can see by the color. I'll start to do a little delineation there. And then behind that, I forgot to draw it in, but there's actually some totally dried out sepals. Put those in more of a brown. So it's just kind of breaking it down into each bud and what color is in it depending on its age. And I turn the paper sometimes to get a better smooth flow to the brush stroke. I just like to kind of work with what color I have on the brush and find those areas in the painting that need it while I've got it. picking out little areas in these buds. I mean, you can see they're pretty small. So I'm really using the tip of the brush. So moving into the stem a little bit, I'm trying to lightly put in the edge. Where I'm working is the sunstruck area, but the stems have several segments to them, and I'm kind of putting some of those, I wouldn't call them veins, but there's slight ridges. I can't remember now if there's 5 or 6. But I'm putting a little bit of that in, and also darkening up underneath the spent flower, so it helps kind of put the edge to that flower. Anywhere there's places I'm confused, I try and put some of the darks in first, almost like an outline, to give me an edge to work from. And here too with the stems, they're cylindrical, but I like to turn the paper to get the darker side in, and sometimes the brush stroke is easier when the paper's turned. Just little areas, a bit at a time, start to build the form in the stems. And there's a bud in here that I'm a little confused about too, so I start to lay some color on that. Kind of deepen the color for showing the form a little bit more, but also kind of making an edge for me to find that bud that's confusing me. And so I've moved on to the other stem, the top flower, and here I'm putting some darks in to show me the edge of the flower petal, kind of keeping in mind that it's cylindrical. I'm darkening the right side, the shadowier side, but bringing color into the whole thing a little bit at a time. And then with a little deeper, a little more blue, kind of getting that spot between the petal and the stem to pop back a little. So you can see where the little dark bits are. You can see that the colors have been worked up. The values are starting to kind of show the difference between the petals and their translucency and paleness, and the brighter structure of the buds. There's a little more depth in the stems. Things are building up. That one bud I couldn't figure out, I'm starting to find. And so it's just a matter of going back in and mixing a little bit of the cerulean and ultramarine to bring in those tips again. And the hardest part at this point is to not get too dark. You want to keep the translucency, you want to keep the pale blue. And so I've kind of gone back to a wash. And just little by little, starting to put some of the hills and valleys or the ridges in and the veins. They aren't always obvious. They're very subtle, but they're still there. Working on the tips. Again, like I said before, there's 5 on most of them. Sometimes they're clustered together close, and sometimes they're quite dog-toothed. You can see the amount of water back to a wash. And start to just work into the areas that I haven't. There's a few spots where the petals kind of fold over themselves, so I'm using that darker mix to kind of show the underside of the surfer's wave. And these 2 particular petals, it's real obvious that they curl back at you. So I'm putting the shadow in underneath. With mostly ultramarine at this point, but a fine wash again, so I don't get too dark. Here's me feathering. I love feathering. Starting to build the top edge of that wave, that petal, by putting some more shadowy color into the petal behind it. But if you look back at your photo, that petal is very light. So I'm trying to be careful. You just move from one to the other, really watching where the darker areas are. This petal curls back at the top so it's lighter, and then it kind of caves in the middle, so I put a little more dark. This guy really goes in deep towards the center. And there's the edge. So I just keep working around the other petals a little bit at a time with that cerulean ultramarine mix, defining the edges a little bit in the dark areas that the petals go in towards the center of the flower. And still kind of working on those little waves because they're curled, way up in front but deep down in the back. Bring a little bit more layer at a time. And I'd rather put 5 or 6 layers than go too dark with something that's not quite right. That's where you get the subtleties. That's how the softness kind of shows up. It's by working little by little. It's just short, quick little strokes, adding layer on layer. And then one of the things I use sometimes is perylene green, but you can mix it just as easily with the colors we have. But it gives me a dark right away. You have to be really careful with it because it can be too dark, and it's not really a natural color. But it does help me get into some of those little spots that I need just a little more oomph right away, little shadow areas that are subtle. Here's another bud that I've kind of been avoiding. So I get the form of that in lightly. And then back to the buds, there's a lot of depth, a lot of foreshortening in these guys. And so I'll go in with that perylene green, but you can make a nice darker green yourself. And just start to kind of pick out what's behind the stem or what's underneath. If that bottom bud is the furthest one away, this little guy is behind. And it's also a brand new baby bud, so the sepals are very thin. Just kind of putting touches here and there. There's actually a sepal here that kind of curls away from the spent bud. I'm kind of showing how the points are darker. The color of the sepals themselves is very pale, but as they're starting to get older, they get a little darker. I'm going to go back into one of the spots that's way in towards the stem and start to darken that. Bring that sepal kind of behind the spent pale flower. And work on some of the little edges. Use snodgrassing a lot in these areas. You just put a touch of color in a corner to push one thing back and the other forward. These tiny little bits really help push things front and back. And because it's so foreshortened, I mean, there's some really dark, dark areas where the buds go in towards the stem. A lot of them are almost facing you in the face. So in the stills, you have a chance to look at how the cluster of buds is taking shape. The subtleties in the petals are starting to build. There's a little movement to them. And you can see the contrast between the flowers and the buds. I've darkened up the areas a little bit more in this flower and spent some more time on the buds. Now, one of my worries working on these is that I was getting too dark. The ultramarine is a little too much of a dark blue, and these flowers and petals are really quite bright. So we found in Marilyn's box of goodies a color called verditer blue, and it's much more of a periwinkle blue. The cerulean's kind of flat and the cobalt's kind of dark. And this verditer color really captures the essence of the color of the flowers themselves. So we're going back in and playing with it, starting to add some of the veining, putting a little bit more in the darker areas, but still leaving the light nice and subtle. So trying to add color without a lot of it, back to a glaze kind of thing. I'm just looking more closely at the details of what's going on in each petal. And we've been kind of general so far, but now we're starting to narrow in on the botanical aspects or the actual form aspects. So little light strokes. I've got a little bit more color and pigment on the brush now, a little less water, but I'm not dry brush yet. Really looking at each vein. And then that little bit of color really pops that next petal behind. So these are the differences in the verditer, which we found, and the ultramarine and the cerulean that we used. So with this wonderful new verditer color, I'm a little more confident in really getting into the petals, really working them up. Still looking at where the high spots and the low spots are, but bringing a little more depth. See what a difference that makes. Still pretty moist, not dry yet. Building those layers, building the form, and making the color richer without undoing the transparency or the translucency of the petals. You work this way on each one at a time, a little bit here and there, and kind of play each petal against the other to decide where you need to add or subtract. A little shadow, a little more darkness. I'm working on building up the buds. There's a lot more color, a lot more depth to this particular still. Thank you very much. Hope to see you in class soon.